The morning mist clung to the fjord like a ghostly veil as Bjorn the Red squinted at the horizon, his weathered hands gripping the steering oar of his long ship. Around him 36 oarsmen sat, ready, their breath visible in the crisp Nordic air. Today would mark the beginning of another impossible journey across the endless waters, guided by nothing more than the ancient wisdom passed down through generations of seafaring warriors. Bjorn had learned the secrets of ocean navigation from his grandfather, who had learned from his grandfather before him. These men called themselves Vikings, though history would remember them by that name long after their ships had rotted and their bones had turned to dust. To them, they were simply Norsemen, and the sea was not an obstacle, but a highway that connected distant lands rich with silver slaves and adventure. The sun hung low on the eastern horizon, a pale disk struggling to pierce the morning haze. Bjorn knew this golden orb would be his most faithful companion on the journey ahead. Unlike the later mariners, who would rely on magnetic compasses, the Vikings had developed an intimate relationship with the celestial dance above their heads. They understood that the sun rose in the east and set in the west, but more importantly, they knew how to track its movement throughout the day to maintain their bearing. As the crew pushed off from the rocky shore, Bjorn reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a piece of crystal no larger than his thumb. The men called it a sunstone, though scholars centuries later would identify it as Iceland spar, a naturally occurring calcite crystal with remarkable optical properties. When Bjorn held the crystal up to the overcast sky and rotated it slowly, he could detect the polarized light of the hidden sun even through thick clouds. The physics behind this phenomenon would not be understood for another 1,000 years. But the Vikings had discovered through trial and error that certain crystals could reveal the sun's position even when it was completely obscured by weather. The polarized light waves from the sun maintained their orientation as they passed through clouds, and the crystal acted like a primitive filter, allowing navigators to determine the sun's location with remarkable accuracy. Young Eric, on his first ocean voyage, watched in fascination as Bjorn demonstrated the sunstone's power. The boy had spent his 16 years learning to raid coastal settlements and swing a battle axe, but the subtle art of navigation seemed like pure magic. Bjorn noticed the youth's wonder and decided to share the deeper mysteries of their craft. "The sun is our master," Bjorn explained as the long ship cut through the swells, "but she demands we understand her moods." He pointed to a wooden disc mounted near the steering position, inscribed with radiating lines and strange markings. This was their sun compass, an ingenious device that worked in conjunction with a vertical gnomon stick to cast shadows indicating direction. The Vikings had observed that the sun's path across the sky changed with the seasons and their latitude. During summer voyages to Iceland or Greenland, the sun traced a higher arc than during winter raids on English monasteries. Their sun compass was marked with multiple shadow curves corresponding to different times of year and geographical positions. By comparing the current shadow with these pre-marked curves, a skilled navigator could determine both direction and approximate time of day. But celestial navigation was only one layer of their maritime knowledge. As the longship sailed further from shore, Bjorn began teaching Eric to read the more subtle signs that the ocean itself provided. The color of the water shifted from the brown-green of coastal shallows to the deep blue of open ocean. These color changes indicated depth and distance from land information crucial for both navigation and safety. The Vikings had also mastered the art of wave reading, a skill that seemed almost supernatural to outsiders. Ocean swells, those long rolling waves that traveled vast distances, maintained consistent patterns that could be detected even far from their source. When swells encountered islands or continental land masses, they created interference patterns, reflected waves and shadow zones that experienced navigators could interpret like a map. Bjorn demonstrated this by having Eric lie flat on the deck and feel the ship's motion. "Close your eyes and tell me what you feel," the older man instructed. At first, Eric only noticed the obvious up and down motion of the waves, but gradually he began to sense subtler movements. There was a slight twist to the ship's motion, a secondary rhythm underlying the primary wave pattern. "That's the reflection of swells bouncing off the coast of Norway," Bjorn explained. "Even though we can no longer see land, the ocean remembers where it is." This technique, called wave piloting, was so sophisticated that it wouldn't be fully understood by modern scientists until the late 20th century. The Vikings were essentially using the ocean as a giant wave interference detector, reading the subtle signatures that land masses left in the water. As the day progressed and the sun climbed higher, the crew fell into the rhythmic routine of long-distance rowing. But their eyes remained constantly alert for the natural signs that could mean the difference between reaching their destination and being lost forever in the North Atlantic. Clouds were particularly important indicators. Certain types of clouds formed over land masses due to thermal updrafts, and experienced Vikings could spot these formations from dozens of miles away. Green-tinged clouds often indicated land covered with vegetation, while clouds with a yellowish hue might suggest sandy beaches. Ice-covered land created distinctive white reflections on the underside of clouds, a phenomenon the Vikings called ice blink. These aerial clues allowed navigators to detect the presence of land masses even when they remained below the horizon. The behavior of seabirds provided another crucial layer of navigational information. Different species had different ranges and habits, and the Vikings had catalogued these patterns through generations of observation. Gannets rarely flew more than 60 miles from their nesting sites, while puffins stayed within about 30 miles of land. The direction birds flew in the evening indicated the location of their roosting areas, usually on nearby islands or coastlines. During one memorable voyage, Bjorn's grandfather had followed a flight of ravens for 3 days through dense fog, eventually arriving at the coast of Iceland, exactly where he had intended. The birds seemed to possess an internal navigation system that the Vikings respected and utilized, understanding that these creatures had been crossing the same waters for countless generations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking navigation was their ability to maintain course during the long polar nights of winter voyages. When the sun disappeared for months at a time, they turned to the stars with the same methodical precision they applied to solar navigation. The North Star Polaris became their primary reference point, though they also used the movements of other constellations to track time and direction. The Vikings identified specific stars that would appear on the horizon at certain times of night when they were on course. If these stars appeared higher or lower than expected, the navigator knew they had drifted north or south of their intended path. This stellar navigation required incredible memory and observational skills, as navigators had to maintain mental maps of the night sky throughout the year and across different latitudes. Temperature and wind patterns provided additional navigational clues. The Vikings understood that different air masses had characteristic temperatures and humidity levels. Cold, dry air typically came from polar regions, while warm, moist air suggested more temperate latitudes. By noting these changes and correlating them with their position estimates, navigators could cross-check their location using multiple environmental indicators. The construction of their ships played a crucial role in their navigational success. Viking longships were designed with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open ocean and inland waterways. This versatility meant they could follow coastlines when possible and strike out across open water when necessary. The ship's flexibility gave navigators options that deeper draft vessels simply didn't possess. As evening approached on this first day of their journey, Bjorn began preparing for the night ahead. Navigation in darkness required different skills and heightened attention to detail. The helmsman would guide the ship by the feel of wind on his face and the sound of water against the hull, while lookouts strained to spot the distant glow of fires on shore or the reflection of starlight on ice. Eric marveled at how his companions seemed to read the ocean like a vast scroll written in a language he was only beginning to understand. Every ripple, every shift in wind direction, every change in the color of sunset clouds carried information that could be crucial to their survival. The Vikings had developed this knowledge not through formal education or written texts, but through generations of practical experience passed down from father to son, from mentor to apprentice. The young man realized that becoming a master navigator would require not just courage and seamanship, but a deep understanding of the natural world that surrounded them. These men were not just warriors or raiders, but scholars of wind and wave, students of sun and star, interpreting the subtle language of the elements with skills that bordered on the mystical. As dawn broke on their 7th day at sea, Bjorn's longship encountered the most treacherous challenge any Viking navigator could face: a thick fog bank that stretched across the horizon like a grey wall. The visibility dropped to mere arm's lengths, transforming their familiar world of sun and stars into a disorienting maze of mist and uncertainty. Yet rather than panic, the crew responded with the calm confidence that came from generations of accumulated wisdom. Eric watched in amazement as Bjorn immediately shifted to what the Vikings called fog sailing techniques. The veteran navigator ordered the crew to ship their oars and listen carefully to the sounds around them. In the eerie silence of the fog, every noise became a potential navigation aid. The different pitches of waves breaking against various types of coastlines created distinct acoustic signatures that experienced sailors could interpret from remarkable distances. Rocky cliffs produced sharp, echoing crashes as waves struck unyielding stone, while sandy beaches created a softer, more prolonged hissing sound. Gravel shores generated a distinctive rattling noise as countless pebbles rolled back and forth with each wave. Even more subtle were the sounds of waves breaking over hidden reefs or shallow areas, creating a bubbling, frothing noise that warned of underwater dangers. Bjorn demonstrated another fog technique by deploying a lead line, a rope with a heavy weight attached to its end. But this wasn't merely for measuring depth. The Vikings had learned to attach tallow or sticky wax to the bottom of the lead weight. When it touched the seafloor, it would bring up samples of sand, mud, shells, or rock fragments. Different coastal areas had characteristic bottom compositions, and skilled navigators maintained mental maps of these underwater signatures. The sample that came up now showed coarse sand mixed with broken shells and small pieces of dark rock. Bjorn nodded with satisfaction. "We're approaching the Shetland Islands," he announced to the crew. "This bottom composition matches what my father described from his raids 30 years ago." The Vikings had essentially created an underwater fingerprint system using bottom samples as a form of geological navigation that complemented their other techniques. But their most ingenious fog navigation method involved the use of specially trained ravens. These intelligent birds possessed an uncanny ability to sense land, even when it remained invisible to human eyes. Viking navigators would release ravens during periods of poor visibility, watching carefully to see if the birds flew in consistent directions or circled back to the ship. If a raven flew steadily in one direction and didn't return, it usually indicated land in that direction. If it circled and returned, the navigator knew they were still far from shore. The practice had given rise to the Viking tradition of carrying land ravens on long voyages, birds specifically trained for navigation purposes. These ravens were different from the war ravens that accompanied raiding parties. Land ravens were pampered and well-fed, kept in special cages, and released only when their guidance was desperately needed. The bond between navigator and raven represented one of the most sophisticated human-animal partnerships in maritime history. As the fog began to lift later that morning, Eric saw his first glimpse of how the Vikings used landfall techniques to pinpoint their exact location. Bjorn had been steering toward what he claimed was a specific inlet on the Shetland coast, but to the young man's eyes, all coastlines looked remarkably similar. However, as they drew closer, distinctive features began to emerge that served as precise navigation markers. A particular combination of cliff height, beach color, and offshore rock formations created a unique coastal signature. The Vikings had memorized hundreds of these landmarks, creating mental maps that were far more detailed than any written chart. They noted the shapes of headlands, the patterns of sea stacks, the colors of cliff faces, and the configurations of natural harbors. These visual landmarks were passed down through oral tradition, with navigators spending years learning the identifying features of coastlines across the North Atlantic. The most skilled Viking navigators could identify their location to within a few hundred yards simply by recognizing coastal features. They understood how different rock formations weathered, how vegetation patterns varied with latitude and local climate, and how human settlements modified the appearance of shorelines. This encyclopedic knowledge of coastal geography represented one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Viking Age, but perhaps their most remarkable innovation was the systematic use of what modern sailors would call dead reckoning, combined with environmental correction factors. Viking navigators maintained constant awareness of their speed direction and elapsed time, creating mental estimates of their position throughout each voyage. However, they also understood that currents, wind, drift, and steering errors would inevitably introduce inaccuracies into these calculations. To compensate for these errors, they developed correction techniques based on environmental observations. If bird behavior suggested they were farther north than their dead reckoning indicated, they would adjust their position estimate accordingly. If watercolor or bottom samples suggested a different depth than expected, they would recalculate their distance from shore. This constant cross-checking between estimated position and environmental indicators created a remarkably robust navigation system. The Vikings also understood the importance of redundant navigation methods. They never relied on a single technique, but instead used multiple overlapping systems that could verify and correct each other. Solar navigation provided primary direction. Finding stellar navigation offered nighttime and seasonal backup wave patterns, gave position information, wildlife behavior, indicated proximity to land, and acoustic cues helped during periods of poor visibility. This multi-layered approach made Viking navigation extremely resilient to individual system failures. If clouds obscured the sun, they could still navigate by waves and wind. If fog eliminated visual references, they could rely on sound and bottom sampling. If weather disrupted multiple systems simultaneously, they could heave to and wait for conditions to improve, confident in their ability to re-establish their position once visibility returned. As their journey continued toward the coast of Scotland, Bjorn began teaching Eric about the seasonal patterns that influenced long-distance navigation. The Vikings understood that ocean conditions, weather patterns, and even the behavior of marine life changed predictably throughout the year. Summer voyages offered longer daylight hours and more stable weather, but also brought increased fog and the challenge of navigating during the brief Arctic nights. Winter voyages, while more dangerous due to storms and cold, provided excellent stellar navigation conditions and distinctive ice patterns that served as navigation aids. The Vikings learned to read ice formations the way they read waves, understanding how sea ice formed, moved, and melted in response to currents and weather. Drift ice could indicate the direction of prevailing currents, while the edge of pack ice often coincided with specific latitudes. The seasonal migration patterns of whales, seals, and fish also provided navigation clues. Different species followed predictable routes between feeding and breeding areas, and the Vikings incorporated this biological calendar into their navigation knowledge. Spotting particular whale species could indicate season latitude and proximity to feeding areas that often coincided with fishing banks or coastal regions. Temperature gradients in the water provided another subtle but reliable navigation aid. The Vikings understood that different water masses had characteristic temperatures, and they could often determine their approximate latitude by noting changes in sea temperature. They developed simple but effective methods for measuring water temperature, such as noting how quickly metal objects cooled when lowered into the sea, or observing the formation of ice on rigging during cold weather. As their longship finally approached the Scottish coast after 8 days of open ocean sailing, Eric marveled at the precision of their landfall. Bjorn had promised to bring them to a specific bay where previous raiding parties had established supply caches, and despite having no magnetic compass, no charts, and no instruments beyond their sunstone and lead line, they arrived within sight of their intended destination. The young warrior realized that what he had witnessed was not primitive navigation, but rather a sophisticated system of environmental awareness that utilized every available natural indicator. The Vikings had essentially turned the entire ocean into a navigation instrument, reading its moods and messages with skills that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern electronic navigation systems. Their success lay not in any single brilliant innovation, but in the systematic integration of countless small observations and techniques into a comprehensive navigation philosophy. They understood that the natural world provided constant information to those who knew how to interpret it, and they had spent generations learning to read the subtle language of sea and sky. As the longship's prow finally scraped against the Scottish shingle, Bjorn smiled at his young apprentice. "The ocean speaks to to those who listen," he said simply. "We've merely learned her language." Eric nodded, understanding that he had witnessed something far more profound than mere seamanship. He had seen the culmination of centuries of human ingenuity, observation, and adaptation techniques that had allowed a few thousand Norse seafarers to discover and colonize lands across an ocean that many believed marked the edge of the world. The legacy of Viking navigation would influence maritime traditions for centuries to come, proving that human intelligence, careful observation, and accumulated wisdom could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. They had conquered the Atlantic not through technological superiority, but through their profound understanding of the natural world and their willingness to trust in knowledge passed down through generations of brave sailors who had faced the unknown with nothing more than skill, courage, and an intimate knowledge of the sea's eternal rhythms.